Good evening, everyone. This is the Planning Commission. The date is Monday, August 24th. Will everyone please rise for Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. The next item of the agenda is the approval of the agenda. We kind of have a light one today, so does anyone have any comments or concerns? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
A motion second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Very good. Moving on to the minutes for the approval of the minutes for the August 10th, 2015 meeting. Are there any changes that need to be made? Anyone have any comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
Move to approve the following Planning Commission minutes for the meeting held Monday, August 10th, 2015. Second.
A motion second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Again, we have a light meeting tonight. We do not have any open hearings for tonight. We do have a planner's report for design standards presentation. Julie, I believe you from the city are going to be leading that one for us.
Yes, sir, I am.
Perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. The following presentation that I'm going to provide to you is a presentation that was provided to the City Council at their work session last Tuesday. The presentation focuses on the design standards initiative, and that initiative is one that arose out of a council visioning session. In the past, we had a community development intern that worked on this project last summer, and as a part of that came forward to several planning commission and city council joint workshops to present visual surveys, provide just general discussion on what is currently allowed by code, what the city council and planning commission see in our community that they like and want to see furthered, and maybe some areas that they'd like to see improved with regard to design and process and of the sort. So this summer we had another community development intern that worked further on these initiatives based on the feedback that was gained from those City Council and Planning Commission workshops, as well as vetted some ideas, if you will, through an internal review process. So what we have this evening before you is essentially an update of where we are on these 5 different topic areas, and as a part of the presentation, what I can do is I can provide you with some of the general feedback and comments that were provided by the City Council as well. And if the Planning Commission has items they'd like to weigh in on or seek further clarification on or address as a commission, certainly please feel free to do so throughout the presentation. So with that, the project or the presentation overview essentially focuses on 5 different topic areas. The first is architectural standards, and then screening and landscaping, some discussion on sustainability, and public art and commercial improvement. So the first is architectural standards. The architectural standards objectives that are in the city code, as well as what was discussed previously by the Planning Commission and City Council, is looking to really create a timeless version of Eden Prairie. One of the strengths that has been identified in discussions is that as you drive through Eden Prairie, you don't drive through and get the feeling of, well, there's a 1980s project and there's something that was built in 1995. It really transcends time and is reflective of the city's character, as well as providing very positive visual qualities of the city. Some of the issues that Council had previously discussed was wanting to encourage the use of sustainable materials more throughout our development process, as well as incorporating design characteristics that really provide a human scale to some of these projects. So the architectural standards conversation is really a two-pronged discussion. The first item is regarding construction materials. So right now the city code provides in the in the commercial and multifamily districts a requirement that 75% of a building facade be a certain breakdown of materials. The other 25% can be varying materials. In the industrial district, same type of thing. The second prong of the architectural standards discussion is the building articulations, roofline deviations, wall articulations, primary entrances. Those are things that are in incorporated into the town center requirements and were a part of the TOD zoning district that you saw, but they are not by and large in code requirements for developments throughout the rest of the city. So as a part of previous discussions, the council had specifically discussed several issues with regard to the 75-25% breakdown. One, there was a question of, are these materials up to date? Are there materials we'd like to add to the list? Are there some that should come off as new technologies are emerging? What should we be considering? And in addition, there was some discussion about, is the 75%, 25% split appropriate? Say, for instance, if a building came in at 100% metal, for instance, is that something that the City Council Planning Commission would be interested in seeing? And kind of how does that play out? So there was a lot of discussion at the work sessions around that. So what, at a staff level, we've come back with is language that you'll see under the highlight section. It basically says that 75% of the exterior could be one of those items listed under the requirements, but it would require that 3 different materials be provided in that within that facade. They would have to be complementary and include one color variation as well. Then for the industrial districts, at least 2 of the approved materials would have to be provided. So as you can see in the list, there are the items that are currently listed under the 75%, 25% split. At the work session last week, the City Council was generally in favor of this language. There was some additional discussion generated around the fact, specifically around face brick and natural stone, where, say, for instance, a building came in and the facade was primarily brick or stone and glass with windows. And it wouldn't meet the 3 required materials, but would they support that? So there was some concern that maybe staff could take a look a little further at maybe weighting some of those materials a little higher and saying, yeah, we'd be okay with only 2 of those, but when you get to other items on the list like architectural precast or precast concrete panels with, aggregate exposed aggregate built into them, then maybe you'd need to require the 3. So kind of providing a little bit of weight within those required materials. An additional item that staff shared with the council based on previous discussion was, as you'll see under the 25% category, vinyl and plastic are listed in that 25% category. Staff, based on the feedback, is proposing that vinyl and plastic be limited to trim materials only and would not be included in that 25% list specifically. So with regard to the discussion about additional materials being added into the 75% list, staff was seeking some direction from the council as to whether fiber cement such as Hardy Plank or Smart Side could be included in that 75% material, and metal again came up in discussion, and based on the idea of requiring at least 2 or 3 materials within that 75%, council expressed that they were generally okay with that type of language moving forward, or at least continuing to be vetted through the process and come back. The sustainable materials discussion is one that staff brought forward based on comments that the Planning Commission and City Council have shared, and in an interest of promoting those sustainable materials. The concern with the sustainable materials would be, have they stood the test of time? As I said earlier in the comments, Eden Prairie is known for its high quality aesthetics. We certainly would like to see that continue and have that required as a part of our codes. So there would continue, of course, to be outreach with the building official and be required materials submitted that verify the durability and longevity of any materials, but we certainly want to continue to encourage those sustainable products where appropriate.
Julie, I have a question. Would
Yep.
you want us to wait until the end for questions, or kind of?
Feel free, because I'll need to take a drink of water here every so often. So if you have questions, feel free to jump in.
So the one question I have, as I was thinking about this, has the city ever mandated or thought about saying, well, any buildings that are being constructed, we want it to last for 100 years, or we want it to last 75 years? Is there anything out there on record that kind of states that?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that there isn't, it's just that I'm not aware of
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Okay.
You know, the general discussion around that has been, that I've been a part of, has been reflective of, again, wanting to make sure that Eden Prairie is not identified as a specific period in time, but rather that as you move throughout the community, you get a sense of Eden Prairie, not as a reflection of where you were in a calendar.
Okay.
Okay? Anything
Any other
else?
questions? Or we take a little bit of a break?
May I
Yeah.
add to that?
Yeah.
And I don't want to answer the question for Julie, but being an architect, we get a lot of questions from our clients on building longevity. And maybe not needless to say, but maintenance of the building, of course, has a lot to do with. Sometimes buildings become obsolete before they become functionally obsolete in their structure as opposed to their use. Maintenance has probably more to do with it in this climate condition. Roofs, joints, windows, things like that. Windows have a tendency to fail first, but generally speaking, we talk to our clients in terms of 40 to 75 years potentially for a well-built commercial structure. Now, if it's built for residential, wood frame, that may have a different life expectancy. Institutional clients will want something a little bit longer life. Rank and file developers may not look for that life expectancy of a building if they're a build and sell type operation. That doesn't mean they're going to fall down in 10 years, of course. But we see a wide range, and different products will fail at different rates that require maintenance along the life cycle of a building that will continue its life expectancy. So it's a complicated thing to say.
Right.
I don't think we want to get into that with the zoning ordinance to say that a building shall be designed to live for 50 years because it needs some tender love and care along the way to make that happen, as well as avoid the use obsolescence of the building.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting putting a time frame in it. I'm just wondering, as we're talking about materials,
Sure.
like as hardy board, is that even designed to last 100 years? I don't think so. I'm not the right person to ask, though. I don't know if you have any comments about it. Like, I wasn't even familiar with, what's the other one? I'm sorry, I didn't bring my glasses, but it was hardy board, and what was the other one?
Smart side.
And what, Smart Side?
Yes.
And I don't even know what that one is, to be honest. Is it like hardy board? I guess it is.
Yes.
Yes, it's similar.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
a similar type
Yeah, they're
product.
coming up with some man-made synthetic siding materials that are durable.
Right.
Like you hear these commercials for lawn chairs, things like that, patio furniture. They're using man-made for deck siding and things like that. They're using
Yeah.
those for homes now and small apartment buildings.
Okay.
Can I continue on? Ask a question of Julie on the materials? This is relatively new to me, so I'm just trying to absorb all this with the 75-25 breakdown that you talked about, and this encouragement of 3 different building materials, and the use is materials as opposed to 3 different finishes, maybe using the same material family. So I can see how a number of buildings would want to be constructed with, let's say, architectural precast concrete by the use of 3 different finishes, let's say sandblasting, exposed aggregate, or some other method of finishing those panels. You could get 3 distinctly different finishes without changing materials. And the same could be said for face brick, of course, with different colorization, different bonding, and things like that. So I think there's a good spirit here to promote variety, but without constraining the design. You want the power of creativity to come from the architect, and we might be ruling out buildings like the Weizmann Art Museum and on the river in the University of Minnesota campus as an example, something that would be on our postcard.
Those are very good comments, and that's the type of feedback that we're looking for in taking these discussion items forward to the
If I could just
policymakers.
build on that a little bit, because Commissioner Farr, I think, has a very good point there, and the at least actually kind of jumped out at me when I saw it. I can understand allowing the variability of up to 3 materials, but to mandate it, I don't know, to me that might be going a little too far.
You just want more flexibility is what you're asking.
I'd love to see the flexibility in there, but, if somebody does have a design that only uses 2 materials or even one as Commissioner Farr said, with varying finishes and all, I think we should be very open to that.
Understood. And the discussion with the City Council, both in the work session last Tuesday and in work sessions previous to this, was that understand that there is always the PUD process. So, for instance, if an architect comes forward as a part of a project with a very unique design that the City Council and Planning Commission may very well be interested in seeing, there is an avenue for that to come forward and for the policymakers to weigh in on it. This language, the language that will ultimately come forward for your review and consideration, is really intended to try and get at some of these improved architectural standards that right now code doesn't necessarily require, but when folks come in with a PUD request, staff certainly works with them cooperatively to try and maintain those objectives. But if a project comes in and it meets all the standards and does not require a PUD, staff's not quite in the same position to have those discussions and invite that give and take, if you will. So providing some additional detail in code is what we're really trying to do and encourage that citywide.
Maybe just before we move off topic, and I know that Julie's going to move on to architectural elements and things like that, but good design is judged on a number of factors besides just material selection, as we all know, the proportion, scale, obviously the context of the project. I've seen a lot of projects that have wonderful materials selected, but misused or not in context, and the project could suffer because of that. Right. So we're trying to pull out one portion of design success and regulate or grade that, and I think we have to be careful that we always look at the project as a whole.
And that's a great segue to my next slides. So architectural elements. This slide demonstrates several of the architectural elements that we would like to discuss. Facade articulations, facade transparency, primary entrances, as Commissioner Farr talked about, really breaking down that mass building scale, creating a positive pedestrian environment. And as you can see from this example, it also includes roofline deviations. As I talked about earlier in my comments, the TOD ordinance in its draft form and the town center ordinance do provide for some of these requirements. However, they are not required citywide. So when a developer comes in with a PUD request, staff sits down with them and through that PUD process tries to work with them to include some of these elements. But in the event that a project comes in and is code compliant right away, there's not really an opportunity for staff to have those conversations. So the question raised to the City Council is, are you interested in seeing some of these requirements move forward? Because as Commissioner Farr said, good design is based on more than just materials. You're looking to incorporate additional elements as well. The general feedback from the council was that yes, they'd be looking to incorporate additional details such as these into the city code to be reflective of development citywide rather than just in specific zoning districts. So staff will continue to work on these efforts as well and fine-tune draft language that, as I said, would be vetted through an internal process and then through a public process as well. The second issue that we'd like to talk about with you this evening is screening and landscaping. And the overall theme of this portion of the discussion is really that screening and landscaping can serve many functions. It's, of course, aesthetically pleasing. It can be used to create and direct pedestrian pathways. It can work to implement stormwater management regulations, which we're seeing are becoming more and more important with some of the new rules that are being passed. It also can more clearly define public and private spaces. So when done well, it can do double, triple, even quadruple duty. And you'll see through the next slide some visual examples of how that works on the ground. So this slide just gives, again, kind of an overview of three different topics that we want to talk about under the screening and landscaping. The first issue is understory vegetation. Currently, the city's zoning ordinance allows credit for landscaping materials only for coniferous and deciduous trees, even though many developers include perennials and grasses and shrubs within their landscaping plans. Those are not necessarily counted as credit toward their landscaping requirements. And when you drive through Eden Prairie, you certainly can see a variety of examples of where these types of materials are are used on site and are used incredibly well to create a sense of place and just overall beautification of the property. So staff has questioned the city council if they'd like to see something built into the requirements to allow some credit for that. There was positive feedback on that. Concern or discussion, I should say, did ensue about the maintenance of those areas, because those areas do require a high level of maintenance, and when it's installed, say in 2015, and it's maintained as ownership changes, what leverage or what requirements are in place to ensure that in 2040 it's still being maintained to the level that the city intended it to be when it was originally approved. There was also some discussion about what's the appropriate balance between trees and landscaping on site, making sure that we still, as a community, continue to incorporate the appropriate amount of trees to provide screening overall. Then these next 3 slides, I believe it is, kind of really touch on what landscaping can do in parking lots. So parking lots without landscaping, of course, are a great big mass of asphalt. They produce a heat island effect. And as you can see from these slides, there are examples shown of how landscaping can be used to meet stormwater management needs, as well as direct pedestrian traffic and beautify parking islands. This slide shows examples of how landscaping can be utilized to meet stormwater management on site. Also, I believe permeable pavers are shown on this slide as well. So as you can see, it creates not only a visual break in the parking lot, but it also can direct pedestrian traffic. And then this last slide is again an example, several examples of creating that pedestrian connection as well as directing vehicular traffic through the parking area. Right now, city code requires that 5% of a parking lot include parking islands. The code does not go on to define what those parking islands should look like or what they should contain. So for instance, there's not a minimum size. A developer could propose to put rock or mulch or, very bare bones materials within those areas. So staff was seeking some direction from council as to whether or not they'd like to see some additional information provided in the code, which would really provide more direction to property owners and really work to meet some of these objectives. And again, the feedback was positive, so staff will continue to research that and work through a variety of proposals as how to best accommodate that. The other provision in code that staff wanted some specific feedback on was screening. Code requires that all of the parking areas be screened from differing land uses and public rights-of-way. So, of course, if there's screening in place, sometimes that isn't always conducive to creating pedestrian connections because there need to be a break in that screening. So right now, as code is written and how it's been practiced, staff would not necessarily encourage that or would have to work with a developer specifically to address that. And the City Council, in their discussion last Tuesday, was again very open to the idea of allowing for a break within those screening materials in order to provide pedestrian connections and make sure that visibility is maintained within those areas. Any comments before we move on to sustainability?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Julie, I noticed that all of your great photography in your presentation was taken through the months of May through October. And since we live in Minnesota and we have a lot of snow, I don't know of any ordinance in the local area that has this, but I'm always asked as an architect when we present our projects whether or not we've taken snow storage into consideration. And I know snow storage can become a touchy issue when we're trying to develop the maximum coverage.
Yep.
And sometimes snow removal can be done well. Sometimes snow storage on site can be, frankly, a nuisance to the public and building occupants if done poorly. And the impact on islands sometimes it kills landscaping, of course. And so many property owners are keen to this. Some are not. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if guidance is warranted or if there's a judgment factor that we ought to play in with some of the landscape selections in relationship to snow storage locations, rain gardens, and other popular stormwater management features that sometimes play well and don't play well with tall piles of snow.
And historically, as staff is working with developers to review the landscaping plans that they submit, staff is looking with an eye towards, are the plans they're proposing salt tolerant? Are they placed far enough away from the right-of-way that they would survive? But those are all good comments that we would continue to seek feedback and do additional research on as we're looking to come forward with some additional language for consideration.
Okay. Thank you.
Julie, do you mind if we just kind of go back through these real quick? I just want to capture any comments that anyone has. So I think we talked about materials for consideration a little bit. Does anyone have any questions about architectural elements at all? Or any comments?
Well, I have Mr. Chair,
Yes, please, go ahead.
I have a comment that I was going to address earlier, but
Okay.
I might as well do it now
Yeah.
on materials themselves and to some of the statements that were being made earlier between you and Commissioner Farr. I just thought in my head that there was an email that came in today about a new or a product. I've never had any experience with it, but it's if I can get my computer here. It's a product, Formawall Graphic Series insulated metal wall panels, and I don't know, maybe you've had, it's more down your line of commercial building design, but it's made by Centria, and I don't know if this is new or if this is old, but I've never used them because I don't do commercial development, and we don't want to pigeonhole ourselves into thinking that metal, in the 25% category, metal is just that metal. Well, these are relief, directional relieves and reveals in the design itself, and you can, from what I was reading earlier today, you can do a lot with these in creating facade breakups and architectural designs. So I don't know if you had any other thoughts. My only thought was we don't want to pigeonhole ourselves into remembering, well, you know, concrete looks like this, but then they came out with precast architectural concrete panels. Oh, okay, well, let's incorporate that. Well, now we've got metal. Well, then there's going to be a new technology out there, probably along the lines of plastics, that will, you know, question our line of thinking again. So I don't know if we want to draft something that's so discouraging to creativity in the architectural world. I know the engineers would love to hear everything that needs to be said in code so that they can follow it to the T, but that does stifle a lot of creativity by the architects. So that was my only comment.
Okay, anybody else?
Mr. Chair, just in follow-up, I believe that your comments about metal panels are spot on. The brand you mentioned, Centria, makes a wide variety of panel finishes and profiles for architects to select from, and there are some really stunning metal panel buildings in the area, as well as nationwide. One of the benefits of metal panels is that it's a relatively lightweight material, so it's useful in not only original building construction, but remodeling. When you're trying to remove another lightweight product from a building, let's say maybe a building had EFIS on it, and they want to replace it with something more durable, metal panel might be a good selection because structurally it doesn't demand a lot of the exterior wall for support, like brick would. If you were trying to replace a building with brick, you wouldn't have the capacity in the beams to do that with the weight. So so your comments are spot on, and I appreciate your input on that.
To that point, where you're talking about the remodeling and the construction of it, it comes to mind the sustainability factor of it too. And when I think of sustainability, I don't think necessarily the green aspect of it. I think of the economics behind sustainability and what are the aggregate costs to that sustainability. You're going to implement a certain type of material or implement or design a certain road structure, but that may increase carbon emissions due to increased traffic on a longer stretch of road. You're going to put a sidewalk right next to the road when it would be better to cut it right through so you have sidewalks or paths that have some sort of amenity that they're going towards instead of just paralleling a road. That would decrease the impervious surface area, increase the green space area, decrease the traffic pedestrian and the vehicular pedestrian interface. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold here. So that the sustainability factor, that's what I think of, is not just one angle, the green angle, but the economics of it, the viability of it, the long-term maintenance costs, and all that stuff. So to your point there, too.
There's a phrase in the industry called cradle to grave economy. The extraction of the material from Mother Earth, if it is in fact coming from the earth, whether it's brick, stone, one of those materials, and then through its life cycle, and then how that can be recycled if the building is demolished or not. If it goes into a landfill, of course, that's not a good objective.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. Architectural elements. Does anyone have any comments regarding that slide? Okay. Screening and landscaping.
I had a quick comment, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yep, please.
The vegetation, and we were discussing islands, and infiltration basins came to mind when using islands, especially in larger lot areas. That could be a capability. Well, we've got a lot of snow, like you said, and I was going to bring that point up. So how do we qualify the plantings themselves within our LGU versus what the cost to implementation and maintenance is on the private sector area? I don't know how that matrix would play out, but that would be an interesting study to do. And then another thing is I see around town when I'm driving, mostly in private residential areas, like single-family areas, the incorporation of low-maintenance natural plantings. And you're smiling. Were you going to talk about that later, or?
Coming up.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
All right, I'll delay.
Mr. Chair, if I could add a comment, just because that screening landscaping slide happened to show some curbing, I might just bring up the topic of curbing. City engineering departments are typically promoting the standard B612 concrete curb and gutter profile for years and years now. In parking lots, of course, that does a good job of containing a car, although they're not proposed to be wheel stops, but they are used as wheel stops many times. And the newer adaptation of rain gardens and other landscape stormwater management features likes to have runoff from parking areas towards infiltration areas without the B612 curb as a barrier to flow. And I didn't know if the engineering department was keeping up with some of these sustainable movements and allowing for or promoting deviations from the standard B612 requirement.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, we certainly, as a part of the development proposals that we have seen lately, based on new stormwater regulations that have been put in place, we are seeing more and more rain gardens coming in as a part of those initial proposals. So certainly, planning staff and engineering staff are reviewing those holistically to determine what specific elements make the most sense in which locations. So we're continuing to take a look at that.
Okay, good.
Understory vegetation. Any comments as far as that goes? Parking lots and islands.
Mr. Chair,
Please.
just to follow up on my curbing comment, and just for my own information, do we allow or permit other curbing solutions like precast concrete wheel stops, man-made synthetic wheel stops, or rolled bituminous curbs as alternatives to concrete curbs in parking lots?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, I can't speak to that as eloquently as probably some of our other staff members can, but I can tell you is that being involved in internal staff discussions, there have been a variety of different curbing materials proposed and discussed as a part of that. So I believe the answer to your question is yes, the engineering staff is open to that, but if you're asking me specifics as to what's been allowed and what has been considered, I wouldn't have that detail to provide to you, but we can certainly further that discussion through these efforts, and when we come back to you with additional information, we can certainly speak toward that.
Okay. I only bring that up because some municipalities have found that problematic to manage. Some property owners who have those, I'll call them portable wheel stops. If they're not affixed properly, snow plows can dislodge them. If used properly, they're an effective tool that allows drainage without the B612 curb and gutter. So I didn't know if the city had a policy on there, something to look into as long as it was carefully dealt with.
Moving on to stormwater and permeable pavement. Anybody have any comments about that? Okay. Not seeing any. Parking lots, circulation. Screening and pedestrian breaks. Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
I didn't hear the word berming in your discussion, Julie, and with screening, there's an implication there of hiding cars potentially from the public way. I'm reading into that. So with the introduction of rain gardens, which are usually lower swale areas versus the conventional berm between the street and the parking lot, has there been dialogue about that conflict of whether to dip down for stormwater management or to berm up for screening?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, certainly at a staff level, there's been that discussion. Historically, Eden Prairie has seen a lot of berming take place to screen parking areas from public right-of-ways or differing land uses. And now that there are new up-and-coming stormwater management practices, that has been discussed at a staff level is kind of what does this mean for Eden Prairie moving forward, and how it may or may that not impact berms in the future. So that's certainly something that we would have to take a look at as a part of these regulations and kind of balance, if you will, historical practice, new practices that are evolving with the development and stormwater rules that we're seeing in place, and how do we manage those.
Okay. I think that takes us to your current slide of sustainability.
So sustainability, the discussion that we want to have really focuses on not only the, I'm going to call them alternative energy sources, but also discussing a little bit about the environmental side of things as well. So for instance, talking about solar, wind, and geothermal alternative energy sources. Within the city of Eden Prairie, if an inquiry were to be received by the planning division about can I put some solar panels on my roof, can I install a small wind turbine to serve my lot, there are currently some provisions in code that would guide staff to work with property owners as to how they could do that. Certainly with regard to geothermal, because those systems are primarily underground, there's not as much of a zoning impact there, and those are reviewed through the building permit process. But any ground-mounted equipment, of course, would be required to meet any city code requirements. The big question that staff posed to City Council last Tuesday was not necessarily to individual commercial or residential property owners, but in the event of a request that came in for a solar farm or a wind farm, what was the general feeling of the City Council on that, and if they were looking to allow that as a primary use, what concerns they might have about height or screening and visibility, things of that sort. And the discussion last Tuesday really focused, I think, on the fact that Eden Prairie is by and large pretty much a fully developed community. There are limited areas that could allow for wind and solar farms to be placed. Couple that with the fact that there is an airport within our municipality that provides additional challenges as well. So the takeaway from the discussion at the work session last Tuesday was to really focus staff's efforts on whether or not we need to take a look at implementing additional requirements that would more clearly identify any requirements to be put in place to address any noise generated from a wind turbine, shadowing effects that may happen from a wind energy service that is proposed on a privately owned lot, and not necessarily focus on a primary use of a wind or solar farm, because that's by and large highly unlikely in a community in Eden Prairie's situation. And certainly there are other communities. Minnetrist is one that comes to mind that recently have wrestled with this issue, so there are certainly a multitude of information out there that staff can rely on as a part of that research. The second part of the sustainability discussion really goes to some of the objectives that were pursued with the Eden Gardens development project that the Planning Commission and City Council recently reviewed. One of the discussion items that came out of that was the prohibition of neonicotinoids, which can inhibit the bee population and other pollinators. Also, promoting water conservation efforts through low-mow or no-mow or drought-tolerant plantings, as well as native plantings being incorporated. These aren't things that are currently required by code, but as staff worked through the Eden Gardens development, those were, as I said, objectives that were memorialized in the development agreement, and City Council was very supportive of those as well and working to encourage those within our development proposals. And then the last two items that we want to discuss are really more of an update. Public art is something that the City Council and Planning Commission discussed in their work sessions last year, and whether or not, and I shouldn't say whether or not, how to best capture public art, and then also commercial improvements. So with regard to public art, staff has researched this a bit further, and there is state statute that talks about requirements, or outlines policy rather, for cities of the first class, like Minneapolis and St. Paul. It provides them some direction on public art. Eden Prairie is a city of the second class, so there is not that additional support for public art. So what the city has done in several projects has worked with the developer. Several come to mind: the UHG campus and the Martin Blue projects both have incorporated public art as a part of those development review processes. So the question posed to council was really, do you want to allow, incent, or require? And of course, based on the information that I just talked about the state statute, requiring is not the direction that we would go, unless, of course, it was a project that had public dollars, such as TIF dollars, attached to it. At that point, the city could require public art to be incorporated into that. Feedback from the City Council was certainly that they'd want to allow public art, maybe even incent it through the PUD process or other processes, and staff's been tasked with doing some additional research on how other suburbs that are able to capture or have been successful in implementing public art in their communities, what have they done? So staff will be continuing to do some outreach and research on that as well. I don't know if you want to talk about this one before we move to the last one, or you want me to just keep going?
Go to the last one, and then we'll circle back.
Then the last issue or slide this evening is with regard to commercial improvement. The City Council did speak last year at their work sessions about commercial rehab with regard to, kind of as we talked about early on in the presentation, having some properties within the city that you notice just maybe need a little updating. They just are looking a little old and tired and maybe need a little makeup. So one of the things that council had generated some discussion on was how can we as a community work to really incent some of those commercial improvements, because as you well know, Eden Prairie is where people want to be. Even though those buildings may look a little outdated, they still rent very well and don't have vacancies. So there isn't always enough motivation for a property owner to pursue improvements. So staff has recently become aware of a Hennepin County grant that is available. There's $195,000 specifically targeted towards suburban communities. The most that a community can request is $50,000. So staff is pursuing that and hoping to use that as a jumping off point, if you will, maybe through a revolving loan fund, or using that as some type of grant partnered with some matching funds, something of that sort. We clearly haven't sorted out all the details yet, but we're just taking the first steps in pursuing that grant and possibly making that available towards building facade improvements or sustainability upgrades or accessibility upgrades. So there would be more to come on that in the future.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, Julie, I just have, this is probably completely the wrong time and context for this, but I have one thing that just irritates me about our city, and in fact, I think the city has no control over it. I drive on Pioneer Trail by Flying Cloud Field every day going to work and coming home, and talk about some commercial buildings that really need improvement. I'm sure there's nothing we can do to incent the MAC, but those are eyesores in Eden Prairie when you drive by some of the old hangars and things there. So It just, when you talk about commercial improvement, to me, unfortunately, we have no control over that. At least I believe we don't have any control over it. But it certainly is an area that, would be the primary area in Eden Prairie I would point to for some level of commercial improvement, some visual improvement. Just had to get it off my chest.
Do you feel better?
I do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I jump on that
Yes, please,
bandwagon?
go ahead.
I'm going to broaden that comment out. I think that if there's any way we as a city can look at all of the other jurisdictions and public utilities that affect the visual impact in our city, I think that's one huge one that you just brought up. I have a couple irritants myself, and as long as we're relieving ourselves, getting things off of our chest, the two big ones for me are whenever you drive a highway and you go underneath the bridge, MnDOT and the federal government always paints the concrete bridge this jade green color, and that green fades to this putrid brown within 2 years. And all of our major bridge structures up and down, I can name a few, right here at Mitchell Road over Highway 5. The paint is faded, and do we have any way at all of calling up those other jurisdictions and saying, hey, clean up your visual clutter? The other one that was a public nuisance, and then it got repaired, I think, about 3 years ago, the electric highline poles along Highway 5 used to be painted steel. The paint flaked off. They rusted. They got replaced with galvanized steel, I believe. And so someone took the initiative to replace those on a one-to-one basis. It must have cost them millions of dollars, of course, probably all of us taxpayers. But there are just, I can go down the list of all the public utilities, and you mentioned the MAC, where if someone is policing the maintenance of their infrastructure, it's right here in our yard, our front yard, our backyards, our streets, and we could probably go around the table and get a few more irritants, but I had to get that off my chest as long as John did. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Just a comment along those same lines. So I was just thinking, as I like those points, if I'm someone that wants to build a simple warehouse, are we building this? So I would rather just go to build it in Shakopee. So if I want a simple warehouse, not really any public coming in, I have to start thinking, I have to articulate the facade and the facade transparency. Are we making this so if I have a simple project like that, I would rather just go to another city?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that of course is the balance, because we certainly want to be inviting to commercial, industrial, and residential tenants and residents, but we also want to, as a community, maintain that high quality of development and that high aesthetic value. So it is a bit of a balancing act. You know, as I said, these are at this point ideas that are being brought forward as a part of the visioning and initiative that the council has begun, and any language that becomes more formal, if you will certainly be back in front of this body and the city council for their review and comment.
One more side question.
Yeah.
It's really interesting discussion about the metal that you brought up. Is there something, a way that the 25% we could describe the material as, I don't know, plain wood or plain metal, or is there a term that, because I think that's really interesting. We don't want to kind of pigeonhole ourselves into all metals. That doesn't count for 75%, but if there is a metal that would meet it aesthetically, could we describe that somehow? I don't know. That's a question for...
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that's certainly something staff would anticipate. As you know, we just got this feedback last Tuesday. We expect that we will do a bit more research on that, taking the comments not only of the council but of the commission as well this evening, and furthering your thoughts and reflecting those in any draft language that might be considered in the future. So that's certainly noted.
Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Can I follow up on a comment that was made just about, I think, design sensitivities, the comment about the warehouse being built in different cities. We don't weigh, or we don't suggest this in our zoning ordinance, that we put a greater value of good design and selection of materials on buildings that are more visually available from the public way than we do on a building that could be at the end of a half-mile cul-de-sac and quite a bit away from high volumes of traffic. Not saying that those buildings that are tucked away at the end of a neighborhood have an excuse for not following basic design guidelines, but we're putting them on an equal scale because we haven't addressed that issue. And I don't know if that should become a performance standard that is higher for a greater visibility piece of property in the city. I just bring that up because, again, context is everything. And we do have a number of cul-de-sacs in this city, and I'm going to try to lighten the burden on those projects, but the high-profile projects along highly trafficked routes, I think would concern us all at a greater level, and that's not written anywhere.
I mean, they should be treated differently at a higher traffic volume area than some place that's not. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think they are without it being written down in our ordinance. Just the short time I've been here, I think that I've heard comments about this is an important piece of property, or this is highly visible, and therefore. So I don't think that's written in the ordinance, but I think we try and be good stewards of some very visually important pieces of property. And I don't know if that should play into that. I wanted to bring it up maybe more for discussion than anything, but I think we're naturally more sensitive to that. And to the point about the warehouse, that's why I thought of it, because warehouses are sometimes, as the general public may say, tucked away in an industrial district that I never see. And it would be a crying shame if they thought that Shakopee would be a better value to put a warehouse, because I don't drive by that industrial park every day. The workers do.
Right.
So to be attractive, to meet the economic conditions of today, tomorrow, and et cetera, maybe there ought to be a balance between that's why I said the visual impact from the public way.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I guess I have myself to blame. I think about when MDOT built their, over there by Shady Oak Road and off 5, that big white dome where they leave all the salt. I look at that thing every day and I go, what was I thinking? But then you look at the one that's over by the landfill area, it's basically the same type of building, and that seems to just kind of fit more than it does where MDOT put that salt, I don't know what you want to call it, structure there. For what it's worth, I don't know. But I just think, I think that, I guess going to that point right there, that it's a high traffic area. Or we told MDOT, yeah, it'd be okay to build that. If I could dial back time, I'd probably do something a little different.
I was thinking we didn't get a voice on that one. We got a voice on the city's one, but I don't think we got.
So I can sleep better at night knowing that I had nothing to do with that? Is that what you're trying to say? It's still ugly. All right, let's move on. Anything on solar, wind, or geothermal when it comes to sustainability that anyone has any comments on?
This is an exciting topic, I think, and I don't think the city ought to be reactive on sustainable movements. I think they ought to be proactive, and obviously sustainable features, especially in energy, are here. They're becoming more affordable. And I don't know if the city has looked into the scale of the rollout of different sources of energy. In other words, if we're going to be reacting to one property owner's selection of a wind turbine, or one property applicant's 5 solar panels on his house or small commercial building, when in fact we could get an energy expert to tell us that the scale for efficiency in our climate for solar is a solar array of certain proportion and size that would serve a neighborhood 5 square blocks. I just pulled that number out of the air, of course. Or the scale of the most efficient rollout of wind in the city of Eden Prairie could be so many kilowatts and serve so many properties, whether that's commercial or residential, and do land mapping to find out where the wind flows are in Eden Prairie. We're right on a bluff, of course. We've got natural wind flows up and down the Minnesota River Valley, and perhaps some guidance instead of waiting for an applicant to tell us he wants to put up a wind turbine when we don't know what the proper scale of rollout ought to be. Geothermal, of course, is another one. It's a great technology. It's borderline unaffordable for most commercial properties. I've looked at it myself a number of times. Yet, if a planned industrial or planned commercial district invests in something like that, even if subsidized by the city, and I don't want to get into any financial analysis, but again, the scale of the rollout makes these affordable, possible, and promotes the whole sustainable movement. So I would encourage there be, I don't know if I should use the phrase energy districts, or thought of the scale of those future energy sources for consideration.
Valid points. Thank you. I guess kind of moving on to public art. Any comments when it comes to that? Sir.
Mr. Chair, I think there was about maybe a month and a half or 2 months ago, the city of Minneapolis, or maybe it was St. Paul, put forth a large effort of trying to take care of the graffiti and allowing local artists to utilize that space as their canvas. And strangely enough, in Eden Prairie, we have our graffiti areas in certain sectors of the town. I don't know if that is something that has been on the discussion table with the police or the Parks or the Streets Department that maintains these graffiti walls. A number of them are up against 169. That seems to be a very popular area. So that's something I was just addressing on the public art.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other comments?
Follow up with that, if I can put a plug in for a free app called C-Click Fix. I don't know if there's been promotion or discussion upon that app. I use it myself occasionally for the city. If you come across graffiti or any other public nuisance, there's an app that you can click in Eden Prairie. You put down the nuisance real quick, goes right to the city engineering department, and it's on their list to repair it.
Really?
Could be a light bulb out on a street light, could be graffiti on your bridge, anything like that.
I
Great
did not
tool.
know that. What's that?
C-Click
great
Fix.
C-Click Fix.
C-Click Fix.
You can find that information on the city's website.
Okay. Very cool. Did not know that. Nice plug.
No charge. Following up on that art point about whether or not we should allow and center require, well, maybe that was with sustainability, but in terms of the art, I would think that the obvious trade-off for art would be a landscaping requirement.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, that was certainly something that was discussed as a part of the council's discussion last Tuesday. They pointed to previous examples where the city reduced the landscaping requirement for other amenities to be provided, whether that, in the past may have been bike racks or seating areas or fountains, and just making sure that those areas maintain and continue to operate as they were intended with the original development, since there was a credit given to the landscaping requirements. So that is something that the city has historically done in the past, and certainly, as you know, a bike rack or a bench, depending on how it's configured, can certainly serve as public art. And so there are many opportunities for overlap there as well.
Okay.
Just one more thought about public art. We started off this conversation about developing something where buildings are timeless, and then I just had a thought, like sometimes the art piece dates things as well. So I kind of like the landscape. That landscape can kind of substitute for art sometimes. Sometimes you can see something, you're like, oh, that was clearly the 70s. But
Right. Has the city ever started an art program? I'm going to age myself by saying, remember in Chicago they had the painted cows. That was probably 20 years ago, where full-size cow was painted, thousands of them, and placed throughout the city of Chicago. It was Chicago Fire historical nod. Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, they did the same thing with a large sturgeon fish throughout the city.
St. Paul did it with
Snoopy.
Peanuts, yeah.
Peanuts, yeah, thank you. So, not that we want to just piggyback on that same concept, but the notion of an art program to bring art into the forefront. There's a popular one in Naperville, Illinois, I'm aware of, where they do something similar, a different sculpture that's painted by residents annually or every 2 years at least. It's very popular. Just might recommend that the Art Council maybe look into something like that to add a little excitement to our city.
Like a giant loom.
Giant loom. We got his creative juices flowing already.
Right.
Good.
Right. Commissioners, thanks for your comments. Anything else? Any closing comments?
Julie, do we have an art and sculpture ordinance? I thought I remember reading that at one point.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, roughly about 2 years ago, there was a text amendment that came forward that addressed art and statuary and sculptures in order to address appropriate size, height, specifically, I believe, was the issue. I'd have to pull the language back up because I'm not recalling it right off the top of my head. But that was something that was addressed roughly 2 years ago. So that's certainly something that staff would consider as a part of this as well.
Okay.
And then one quick other thing, and I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on it, but the credit that you described on the vegetation or the landscaping, and there was a question posed earlier in the slides on credit for perennials and other understory vegetation, I guess, for lack of a better word. I would be in favor of something similar to that, as right now what we're doing is just promoting tree growth, and trees are wonderful, but there's a lot of other things that can be done in tight corners where trees are infeasible. So.
Thank you all for your comments.
Do you need anything more from us? There
There is no
discussion.
motion that is necessary, no formal action. It was for your information and for feedback to staff.
Okay, very good. There are no, as we talked about, no public hearings tonight. That was the planners' reports. Any members' reports for tonight? Okay.
Next Community Advisory Commission meeting is tomorrow night.
Okay, very good. Any continuing business? Any new business? If not, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Motion second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting's adjourned.